Hi-fi is usually regarded as a very expensive hobby, but it doesn't have to be. Today, I want to talk about a pretty affordable headphone, an amp DAC solution for it, and a modification that can take it one step further. Let's get into it. Well, if you're seasoned in the hobby, you may recognize this headphone. It's the Headphone HE400SE. Well, that in itself, it's a pretty cheap piece of gear that's known for decent performance, but it can get better. If you're not familiar with this headphone, well, it's a sub $100 planar magnetic driver open back headphone. Now, it's not perfect. I'll go over some of the upsides and downsides of its sound and what we can do to improve it. Before we get too far into this, let's make a deal. If you find this headphone, this modification, this idea good or useful, well, subscribe by the end of the video. If not, leave a comment down below letting me know why you don't think it's any good or why people shouldn't do it. Okay, let's get back to the video. So the HE400SE, well, it's a little bit shaky in terms of the headband's construction, but the cups are nice, the pads are decent, they have plenty of vertical, horizontal room, and depth. They are interchangeable, you can pull these pads right off, and the cups do have a little bit of swivel as well as plenty of tilt. I personally prefer Headphone's headband style that has a suspension strap rather than this padding on top, but it gets the job done. On the inside right here we have markings for left and for right. And on the bottom we have a dual 3.5mm entry connection, so you can swap out the cables on these. And in fact, you'll probably want to if you go the route that I'm about to tell you about. First off, amplification. This is the Moondrop Dawn Pro. I believe these are somewhere in the ballpark of like 50 to 60 bucks US. It has a Type-C connection on one side to power it, as well as get the signal. Volume controls right here, though you still control the volume digitally with your device. And then the outputs are 3.5mm and 4.4mm. You can hook this up to something like a cell phone, and the 3.5mm, while that will cut it, this is the stock cable for the HE400SE, I would recommend getting a hold of some cable that can plug into this 4.4mm connector. Now, the reason is that 4.4mm connector is going to output more power than the 3.5. Maybe not this cable specifically, because this is a pricier one that came with a Meze headphone, but you can find 3.5mm dual entry to 4.4mm connectors all over the internet at decent prices. Running off that 4.4mm connection, this gets plenty loud for my ears. Now, if you like to absolutely blast your music beyond comprehension, well, you need a desktop amp, or you need a beefier dongle like a Questyle M15, but this is affordable, and this gets much louder than I personally am comfortable listening, certainly to levels where you could damage your hearing. Making this combo with the dongle DAC amp, the headphone, and probably a cable, well, you would spend under $160 US. For an entire hi-fi setup, that's not bad at all, but there's one thing to note. A lot of people say the HE400SE has a little bit too much treble, and what do you know, when we look at the frequency response of it, well, it does. Expanding on the sound, the HE400SE, well, it's a little bit warm-leaning. It has pretty decent bass extension, and, well, that bass is pretty satisfying. It's not as impactful as something like a dynamic driver, but it also extends deeper than most of your open-back dynamics will. Mid-range is pretty full, though again lacking a bit in timbre, and as we get to the treble, ear gain's not bad at all, though it does suffer from a bit of a treble spike. Some people may not mind this, but that treble peak is a bit too much for me. And I found an easy solution to that. All it takes is a piece of tape. I'm going to go over what to do, and then let's talk about the overall sound of the HE400SE and some of its pitfalls. So I'm going to remove the left ear pad. Pulling these tabs out, you can see here is the driver. And right here on this driver is a piece of tape. Now you can see all these magnets spread apart and all these gaps in between them. This piece of tape is covering 3 magnets and 2 gaps towards the back side of the headphone, leaving 1 magnet and gap open. If you do it near the front, it's not going to sound right. If you go too far back or too far forward, it's not going to sound right. But if you do it exactly here, well, what do you know? It cuts out the treble spikes. So I mirrored this for the opposite side, putting in the tape near the back side of the right side of the headphone, and here's the measurements of the difference it made. Now, this headphone is still not perfect by any means, but for a sub $100 headphone, Well, that's pretty impressive, honestly.
Now, this is roughly a 5 decibel change in one narrow band. It does affect the mid-range a little bit, but not too severely, and either way, the headphone still retains its overall warm-leaning characteristic. I would probably like the tuning of this a little bit more if it was slightly less warm-leaning, like if it had the same level of smoothness as it does with the modification, but with the overall tilt being maybe 2 decibels, maybe 3 decibels less.
The treble gets a lot more smooth, and the headphone leans more into its natural, slightly warmer signature. But there's still downsides. There are 2 areas where this headphone struggles a lot with modification and without it, and that is soundstage and timbre. The soundstage of this headphone is just not big, especially with vocals. Modified or not, vocals sound very narrow. Not intimate, but narrow. And while detailed and clear, the timbre of vocals on a lot of instruments definitely suffers compared to dynamics. Things like the HD58X just has better timbre overall, though the HD58X is a $150 headphone. Similarly, in a budget range, there are things like the AD500X. That is also pretty affordable and doesn't need an amplifier, but it has downsides itself. That has better timbre, better soundstage, but lacks in terms of bass and lacks parts of ear gain. Really, it comes down to what you're looking for. Because the HE400SE, well, it has really good bass performance, and it has good detail. And truth be told, although the build isn't flattering, it's pretty good for its price. Is this going to change the world? Absolutely not. But people are getting more and more access to better and better audio gear at a cheaper and cheaper price. I already like this dongle and this headphone to begin with, but with a small modification, I'm getting a lot more life out of it than I otherwise would. As long as you still know the headphone's weaknesses, well, it's pretty dang solid. It just occurred to me that I think that the size of the piece of tape is yes it is. It's very similar to the size of this little dongle amp. That's funny.
Another thing to note is that sometimes the Dawn Pro, when I plug it in, well, it doesn't sound quite right. There will be a bit of a boomy sound in the mid bass, and the deep bass isn't quite there. So I unplug it, I replug it, and then everything works fine. Now, this only happened to me maybe twice out of the several weeks I've been using the Dawn Pro, but it's worth noting that this does happen sometimes. Now, does this mean that the HE400SE is the perfect budget planar? Yes and no. At the sub $100 price point, it's pretty impossible to beat, but if you were to, say, spend a bit more and get something like a Sundara, well, that's going to be way better. Now, granted, a Sundara, that is more expensive, but it's also a lot cheaper than things like LCDs, Aria, Focals, and things of that nature. So it really depends on what your idea of budget is. For some people, budget is a headphone under $300. For some people, budget is a headphone under $150. And there are some ballers out there where a budget headphone is something under $1,000. I don't really agree with that stance. I would say the budget hi-fi setup is anything in the under $300 range. And that's just comparing to how incredibly high the ceiling goes.
I would love to 3D print something that I can put in here instead of a piece of tape down the road and maybe further improve the tuning. That is a big project, and that is for another day. A really short video, again, but I want to know what you guys think. Like I said, good audio is getting cheaper and more accessible than ever. If you have this headphone and try this modification, leave a comment down below because I want to know what you think. Other than that, we'll make all this gear available at the link in the video description, and I think that is going to wrap up this video, guys. If you liked it, leave a like down below. Comment letting me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the community, you can have the forums or Discord, both available at the link in the video description. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Till next one, guys. Peace.